Okay, guys, so I was wondering who built up more worth, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? So I went ahead and looked it up, and it's actually a little bit more complicated than just the raw numbers. One of these guys spent 50 years in public service, and another guy inherited a fortune and built up a huge empire ranging from hotels, golf course, and even a strong political career. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the data shows. So how much is each of them worth, Joe Biden and Donald Trump? So I went ahead and looked it up, and although these aren't concrete numbers, this is information pulled from public data. So a lot of analysts say that Donald Trump is probably worth between $4 billion and $6 billion. A good chunk of that wealth was inherited from his father, who was a real estate developer as well. But over the next 50 years, Donald Trump has built up a huge brand name across various different industries and projects. Now, when we compare that with Joe Biden, he's estimated to be between $10 million and $12 million. However, during most of his career, it was estimated to be much lower than that, maybe $1 million to $2 million. The majority of that wealth came after he was vice president with Barack Obama. After he retired as vice president, it grew rapidly on real estate appreciation, book fees, and speaking fees. So if we're going to gauge just on net worth, Donald Trump wins very easily over Joe Biden. So where did each of them start financially? This is where it gets really interesting because Donald Trump was born into a successful real estate family. His father, Fred Trump, supposedly had left upwards of $400 million for Donald Trump. And that's a mixture of loans, gifts, inheritance from Fred Trump. So Donald J. Trump did start out ahead. I mean, that's a huge war chest to start your career from, $400 million. And we compare that with Joe Biden. Joe Biden grew up in Pennsylvania to a working class family. Supposedly their family struggled financially. In fact, they had to move quite a few times just because the money wasn't there. And when Joe Biden talks about his childhood, he basically says there wasn't really much money and he had to work his way through school. After school, he decided to go ahead and enter into politics and was a public servant through most of his career, living on a public servant salary. So as you can see, their starting was a drastic point of contrast. Donald Trump starting with hundreds of millions of dollars and Joe Biden starting basically from the ground up in a working class family in America. So that brings me to the next question that most people have is, how did Joe Biden build such a huge net worth of millions of dollars on just a government salary? So when I looked it up, it appears that Joe Biden, for most of his career and most of his life, just was one of the least wealthy members of the political parties. On his reportings, they're generally modest finances. He did own a house, but not really much beyond that. The majority of his wealth came after he was vice president of the United States with Barack Obama. After he left office as vice president with Barack Obama, he supposedly signed a book deal worth upwards of $8 million. He was also paid to attend speaking gigs at places like universities or large corporations. And at the same time, his wife, Jill Biden, was able to make her income from and also from book deals. And it appears Joe Biden has been pretty transparent on his financial standings. In fact, like I said, when he was a senator, he was known for years as one of the least wealthy senators that are serving the United States. So that brings me to my next question is with Donald Trump. I mean, he started with $400 million, supposedly, which is a lot more than Joe Biden. How did those business decisions that he made throughout his life perform? So this one's actually pretty surprising. So Donald Trump has done an excellent job of branding himself as the greatest business person and negotiator. And as far as analysts view him, it's actually a mixed bag. In fact, one of the most quoted opinions about his wealth is that the inheritance that he got from his father, Fred Trump, had he just put that into a simple money market, he would be worth much more than $4 billion to $6 billion that he's estimated to be worth right now. And that's because a lot of his active business decisions became failures. In fact, a lot of them were reported in the media, most famously the Atlantic City casinos. And that's in strong contrast to what the identity that he's built up for himself over the years as being a strong businessman. There have been a lot of business ventures that are widely considered failures, and that ranges from Trump Airlines, Trump University, Trump Vodka, Trump Steaks, Trump Magazine. All of those are widely considered failures. However, on the other hand, his real estate branding business has been one of the best known brands, the real estate market. So that includes things like hotels and golf course, and that revenue is going to continue on for decades and decades to come. So as you can see, the record is kind of mixed, but if you are a business person, you know that a lot of times many of our ideas or our businesses are great ideas, but they just don't come to fruition. But really all you need is just that one run, home run. So that brings me to my next question. Who is better at holding on to money, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? So this is an interesting angle that a lot of comparisons just miss. So when we look at Donald Trump, supposedly he has filed for corporate bankruptcy up to 6 different times. So those bankruptcies represent real financial loss, not just for the Trump family. However, that represents lenders, that represents other investors that lost real money in those negotiations. And when we look at Biden, he's never had a major financial failure like bankruptcy. And for the most part, his life has been very vanilla, very mundane, with slow growth over the years. Not really anything to speak about, but same thing, not really any drastic failures like bankruptcy. So there is something to say about financial consistency and someone who never actually loses really big. But at the same time, he didn't have those large upward swings like Donald Trump has. So that's why there's such a big variance in their net worth, $10 to $12 million versus $4 to $6 billion. In fact, Donald Trump himself claims that number is much higher, closer to around $10 billion. So since we're talking about real estate, who has made better real estate decisions, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? So both of these men, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, have owned lots of real estate throughout their career. In fact, Donald Trump has built pretty much his entire identity around real estate. So those are going to include properties like Trump Tower, his golf courses, the hotel brand name. So all of these properties have really held their value and continue to create revenue for decades. And we compare that with, so Biden has owned his home in Delaware for many, many decades and his beach home, but those are basically 2 of his largest real estate holdings. So it's really modest in comparison to Donald Trump, but they ended up being smart long-term purchases. So Donald Trump clearly wins in the real estate department as far as terms of scale and sophistication. Okay, so when we're talking about 2 of these rich guys, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which one of these guys gave more money to charity? So first we'll talk about Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's charitable giving has been controversial throughout his career. In fact, the Trump Foundation was shut down in 2019 by New York State, and allegedly they said it was because it was being used improperly. And a lot of analysts have said that his charitable giving has been really modest in comparison to his financial net worth, and that has been for decades. Now when we compare that with Joe Biden is not really known to be a big charitable giver as well. However, his giving is really modest in comparison to other senators, but of course he was one of the lower net worth senators through most of his career. But the low dollar amount that he was giving to charity was consistent with his public service salary. And after his vice president time with Barack Obama, his charitable giving did increase after that. So when we're comparing the 2, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, neither one of these really speak to charitable giving. It's kind of a draw because the amount of charity that they make donations to is not really much to speak of. So let's talk about who had more financial opportunity right out the gate, right when they were born. So this one really isn't close at all. In fact, Donald Trump is well known to have basically every financial advantage available: wealthy family, access to capital, connections in the New York real estate world. His father actively helped him out with his businesses, basically a safety net anytime something came up. Now, when we talk about Joe Biden basically had none of that available. He was a working class family. He didn't inherit any of his wealth, no business connections. He put himself through law school, entered public servant life just because that's what was available to him. So basically every dollar that he earned came from the public salary income or through his own work. So whatever you think of Joe Biden or Donald Trump, for this particular question, the answer is really clear. One man had basically everything available to him right when he was born, and the other man had basically nothing and had to start from the ground up and worked his way all the way up to the president of the United States. So that context matters a lot when we're comparing 2 different financial outcomes. So you might be asking yourself, is there anything that Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in financially? And the answer is yes. I want to be fair here because Joe Biden did build up financial consistency over the life of his career, which is pretty remarkable, especially when you're starting from a working class family with no inheritance and building yourself up to being a multimillionaire. And that's one of the keys to a disciplined financial life, which includes live means, owning property, building up your savings. And that's actually what most financial advisors recommend for the everyday Joe. In fact, Joe Biden's financial story is one that most regular Americans can relate to. We're talking a government salary, home ownership, modest savings, later in life writing and speaking. So as you can see, it's not really glamorous, but it is simple and many people can replicate it. Now, if you want to try to relate to Donald Trump's story, starting with hundreds of millions of dollars, making high risk bet, while it is aspirational, it's not really likely for the average American. In fact, I would say it's probably impossible. So who actually built more wealth, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? So everything that I could find, Donald Trump wins this category category, hands down. So like I said, most analysts are saying that Donald Trump is worth between $4 billion and $6 billion. Joe Biden only $10 to $12 million, which is a lot of money, but nothing in comparison to Donald Trump. So this is really going to depend on what your definition of wealth building is. If it's going to be just net worth, Donald Trump wins this easily by billions of dollars. However, if you are gauging it from starting at nothing and building up to a good fortune, then Biden would definitely win that, because he started with zero and he made it up to $10 to $12 million, which is nothing compared to billions. But when you're starting with nothing, it just makes it that much harder and less opportunity to make those big bets in life. So there you have it. That's Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. So I started this video just kind of considering who actually started with what and who built up more worth. So I found out that Joe Biden started basically with nothing and Donald Trump started with hundreds of millions of dollars. So what about you? Who do you think built up more wealth throughout their career, Joe Biden or Donald Trump? Leave a comment below, let the rest of us know, and I'll see you on the next video.